This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. The course of the hour will run through all the business news stories you need to know about from Africa and beyond. But let's start with a quick run through the markets here for you. So the first quarter of the year, by all accounts, an absolute nightmare for the big equity markets that we track here in sub-Saharan Africa and beyond. But April has allowed them to claw back some of those losses. The all-traded top 40 at the JSE, for example, have risen by 13% since the start of April. Bourses in Nigeria and Egypt also in the positive, over 7% higher over that time frame. Kenya's NSE 20, it's a bit of a mixed bag. It's seen trade volumes twice a daily average on the 21st of April, but it's pretty much flat so far in the month of April, under 2,000 points. Here's what's coming up tonight. Uganda wants to control the movement of truck drivers in order to stop the spread of COVID-19. Investors are abandoning Zimbabwe's equity market in droves. And the EU expects GDP among the 27 member nations to contract by between 5 to 10% in 2020. All that and more is in the pipeline for you tonight. But let's start in Uganda, where the government is exploring a range of measures to control the entry of cross-border cargo truck drivers. These drivers are being blamed for a rise in the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in the East African coffee exporter. Now, authorities over there say their fight against the pathogen is being undermined by imported cases from East Africa, particularly Kenya and Tanzania. This week, Tuesday, for example, the country had 56 cases. The number jumped to 61 a day later on account of 5 cross-border truck drivers, 4 of them from Kenya and 1 from Tanzania. Now, one of the remedial actions authorities in Uganda are considering is relay driving. I spoke to CGTN's Isabel Nakiria a few hours ago. I started by asking how these measures would actually work in practice and if freight companies could opt out.
The relay system that the Minister of Internal Affairs, Mr. J.J. Odongo, was proposing was that the truck drivers stop at the other side of the border. Let's say the Kenyan truck drivers stop on the other side of the border and hand over to the Ugandan drivers on this side. But before they do that, the truck has to be sprayed, disinfected before the Ugandan driver takes over from the border. That's an option so that there's the issue of transmission is a little bit, slowed down.
Right, but what if a company, for example, doesn't have staff across the border in Uganda, or if, say, a company decides not to opt in to this system? What are the alternatives in that case?
This afternoon, the task force, the coronavirus task force at the Ministry of Health is sitting to look at the options that they are going to lay on table, and the relay driving is one of them. But also they are thinking about other options like, for example, testing drivers at the border and making them stay at the border to wait for their results before they continue with their journeys. Previously, they have been testing drivers at the border and letting them go because they don't want congestion at the border. So when the drivers go and the results come back like 4, 5, 6 hours after that, then the driver who tests positive is, traced because they leave all their details at the border. But, there is fear that wherever they are moving, though they have designated points where they stop, but there is fear that there are people that they are interacting with along the way, and these people could easily get infected and, of course, spread the infection to the community.
Indeed. So one of the things that the Interior Minister also said was that one of the reasons why they haven't deployed a lot of these rapid testing kits to the border, in his words, were that the cost was essentially prohibitive. But given the fact that trade must flow back and forth across the border, is there any plan to deploy those test kits to the border as soon as possible?
The issue of truck drivers in Uganda has really given the health workers here a test of time. And this is one issue that they are really thinking of very seriously because, in the last 2 weeks, about 18 to 19 truck drivers have tested positive. And all these truck drivers are from either Kenya or Tanzania. And so the Minister of Health came out on Saturday and said that they were going to deploy, not the rapid testing kit, but the mobile testing kits at the borders. They've secured the mobile laboratories from the East African community, and 2 of them will be deployed, I think one at Malaba and Busia, or at Mutukula border, where the truck drivers are always, plying. We haven't yet had the details whether the mobile units have already arrived, but I think this will quicken the time that the results come out, because they'll make them wait at the border probably for about 3 to 5 hours before their results come out. And if they are negative, then they can't continue with their journeys. And if they are positive, then probably they should be put into isolation or into a health facility for treatment. But that too has not yet been, we haven't yet heard about that. But probably again, the rapid tests could be another option. But Uganda has not yet, got that capacity of rapid tests. There are scientists that are trying out a rapid test, but it takes time, and that will have to wait for a little bit longer.
On to South Africa now, where a state-owned entity, a bank to be specific, which lends primarily to the agricultural sector, has defaulted on payments in 2 bond programs worth a combined $2.6 billion. The ratings agency Fitch says Land Bank defaulted on those 2 notes, and that, it says, adds to the risks posed by state-owned enterprises. It has consistently flagged the risks posed by SOEs, and this was a factor in its decision to lower South Africa's sovereign credit rating this month to BB from BB+. Land Bank is one of several SOEs that are facing severe financial difficulties, and they're all adding pressure on South Africa's limited tax base amidst a recession. The bank mostly funds commercial farmers. It's struggling to deal with the shortfall in liquidity. And we're still in Africa's most industrialized economy. President Cyril Ramaphosa has announced a phased easing of the lockdown over there that was imposed to deal with the pandemic. In a nationwide address on Thursday evening, he explained the policy changes aimed to spare the economy from further long-lasting damage and to save jobs. CGTN's Yolisa Njamela takes up that story.
The relaxation of the lockdown is an attempt to kickstart the economy. In his televised address to the nation, President Cyril Ramaphosa stated that the current lockdown has been effective in slowing down the spread of the coronavirus.
By delaying the spread of the virus, we have had time to prepare our health facilities and mobilize some of the essential medical supplies that are needed to meet the unavoidable increase in infections.
Now, government has decided to implement a risk-adjusted strategy, a strategy that will ensure that the state takes a deliberate and cautious approach to the easing of current lockdown restrictions.
While a nationwide lockdown is probably the most effective means to contain the spread of the virus, it cannot be sustained indefinitely. Our people need to eat, they need to earn a living, companies need to be able to produce and to trade, they need to generate revenue and keep their employees in employment.
This approach, the president says, is guided by advice from scientists who have advised that an abrupt and uncontrolled lifting of restrictions could cause a massive resurgence in infections. The president unveiled new alert levels of the lockdown, which will determine which sectors of the economy would be opened in certain areas. 5 different levels will determine the severity of the lockdown from May 1, with 5 being a hard lockdown and 1 being almost completely lifted.
We've decided on this approach because there is still much that is unknown about the rate and the manner of the spread of the virus within our own population. The action we take now must therefore be measured and incremental.
Ramaphosa revealed that South Africa will move from level 5 lockdown, which is currently underway, to level 4 from 1 May. Some businesses will be allowed to resume operations under specific conditions. The return of the workforce will be no more than 1/3 per business. and a work-from-home strategy is still encouraged.
We have to balance the need to resume economic activity with the imperative to contain the virus and save lives.
Over 70,000 Defence Force personnel will be deployed to assist with various parts of the coronavirus response. The president also said borders will remain closed for international travel, excluding for the repatriation of South Africans abroad and foreign citizens. Travel will also remain prohibited to other provinces in the country, except for special circumstances like attending funerals. Yolisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Now, Brent crude has risen by around 11% or so in the last 3 days of trading, having gone as low as $16 a barrel on Wednesday. But even at the current levels, oil prices are still very close to record lows. Brent, for example, has fallen by over 67% so far in the year. Oil stockpiles are near capacity in the United States, and that in turn has forced traders to store crude in large crude carriers. Here's CGTN's Sumitra Naidu now, exploring the impact of super low oil prices on a net oil importing country like South Africa.
OPEC countries have agreed to cut back on oil production next month. The cartel will cut close to 10 million barrels per day, and another 10 million barrels will be cut by other countries. That's about 20% of global supply, but it's only set to happen towards the end of May into June. In the meantime, there's an oversupply in the market.
We've seen before Saudi Arabia and Russia reaching an agreement that Saudi Arabia was pumping a lot of oil into the market, and there was no demand for that particular oil because lots of economies are closed because of the coronavirus breakout.
Rising stockpiles are pushing the oil price into an abyss. For net importing countries like South Africa, this is good news for consumers.
South Africans can benefit from lower petrol prices, and now, as we know, that transportation costs are a very important factor when it comes to consumer inflation. Then it means consumer inflation won't get out of control, and when that happens, that will give the Reserve Bank more room to decrease interest rates.
The Reserve Bank has cut rates twice in the last month to help stimulate the economy. Fuel prices have also dropped, and if this oil price continues to fall, we could see more relief at the pumps. But it's little benefit to most South Africans that are stuck at home. With much of the world still in lockdown, any gains for South Africa could very quickly be offset by losses.
South Africa is primarily a commodity producing nation, and our exports are predominantly commodities. That might mean that with not only oil going down in price, but other commodity prices because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the net impact on South Africa could well be negative of the lower oil price, along with the other commodity prices.
With some countries slowly lifting restrictions and OPEC set to cut back on oil output next month, oil prices may just start to rise again. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
All right, then let's start in the financial sector for our company news wrap. UBA bank results for the first quarter ending on the 31st of March showed double-digit improvement across major income lines. Now, the bank reported modest growth in both interest and non-interest income. That added up to an 8.5% year-on-year growth in profit before tax in the first quarter to about $90.7 million compared to the same period last year. In aviation, Air Mauritius has joined the list of airlines that have gone into voluntary administration in order to safeguard their assets, their business interests, and of course those of their stakeholders. The carrier says this decision was made in light of the impact that COVID-19 is having on the global aviation industry. Travel restrictions and flight bans right around the world have grounded its fleet of about 14 aircraft and completely eroded its revenue base. In East Africa, Kenya's Twiga Foods has partnered with the e-commerce company Jumia to supply fresh produce within the Kenyan capital and its environs. The two companies have joined forces to enable shoppers to buy fresh fruits and vegetables in pre-packaged bundles from their homes or offices. Jumia will be offering free same-day deliveries within the Kenyan capital. That partnership is expected to help Jumia and Twiga grow their online commerce and food distribution business as well. A deal struck between the Spanish gas firm Naturgy Energy and Italy's Eni and the Egyptian government to resolve a series of disputes over a closed gas plant in northern Egypt has fallen through. The proposed deal would have ended Naturgy's business interests in the North African country and dissolve a joint venture between it and the Italian oil major. In a board filing, Naturgy says that the agreement was based on a series of conditions which had not been met, but it says it's still open to seeking an amicable solution that will satisfy all parties involved. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up shortly. We'll explore why investors are abandoning Zimbabwean equities. And we'll explore how Kenyan retailers are pivoting to e-commerce amidst this coronavirus lockdown.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
Beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sue Trelawney.
Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business. Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues for taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Traders have virtually abandoned Zimbabwe's stock market as the country's lockdown adds to the strains on an economy that was already pretty heavily battered by a severe drought, inflation in triple digits, and a very deep, biting shortage of foreign currency. Trading volumes at the bourse, in fact, have plunged by 55% ever since the government imposed strict measures to limit movement on the 30th of March. The CEO of the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange said foreign participation has dwindled to just 10% of all trades compared to 2019's average of about 34%. Now, that fall-off in trading volumes and foreign investor participation essentially suggests that the exchange is losing its status as a haven for local investors who've in turn turned to stocks as a way of trying to protect their savings in recent years. And we're still in Zimbabwe. The country's homeless are now being moved into shelters. The Southern African nation has also extended its lockdown by about a fortnight. CGTN's Farai Makutuya brings us up to speed with the latest developments.
Farai Shumba, Frank Mwambungo and Tatenda Bingwa live on the street, surviving by collecting empty bottles and washing cars. They were rounded up at the start of the national lockdown and brought to a shelter where they're experiencing a world of difference.
You're assured of a decent night's sleep. You're assured of a meal before you sleep. On the street, there's no guarantee of sleeping because of police patrols, and sometimes there's not enough money for food.
They joke how they wouldn't mind COVID-19 lasting till August so they can stay here during the winter.
The coronavirus has changed my life. If I look at my skin right now, it is different because I'm bathing in clean water and I am eating well.
They've all volunteered to help out in the kitchen and yearn for a fresh start.
As for me, my life is changing and I don't wish to go back in the street.
But the transition to shelters has not been easy for everyone.
We have a big challenge of drug addicts, and they are having to scale the Jurawo at Mount Abden to look for drugs, and we have engaged the Ministry of Health and another NGO which is going to deal with the problem of drug addiction.
Those who are willing at this and similar camps for women and children across the country will receive vocational skills training. This park was one of the preferred spaces for street dwellers to put up for the night. Now that they've been cleared out, authorities want to make sure they never have to resort to it for accommodation again.
We would have failed as a ministry if the majority of these people after the lockdown find themselves back to the streets.
The three I spoke to have no intention of doing so. Tatenda wants to operate earth movers. Frank is hoping to get a driver's license, and Farah is going to try his hand at farming in the village, where the air is much better anyway, he says. Farah Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Now, in East Africa, formal retail sales in Kenya are estimated to have fallen by at least 20% so far in April, mostly due to the restrictions imposed in order to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Kenyan authorities introduced a range of measures to slow down the spread of the pathogen, and that includes a nationwide curfew and, more recently, an order to wear masks while in public. This crisis, however, has proven to be quite a boon for e-commerce. As the CEO of the country's second largest retail chain told me, online sales now account for about half of total daily revenue in some stores.
And in terms of numbers, it's quite shocking that in some of our stores, online sales is up to 50% of daily business now.
But
so
50%, is that localized to specific branches, or is it general across specific regions, like say Nairobi and Mombasa?
We have actually opened it up across the country, so you can order from anywhere in Kenya. We will deliver. If we can't deliver the same day, then we'll try and do the next day. So it's really open across all our stores.
Can we get back to the investments that was required to essentially make this work? Did you have to invest in any last mile capacity yourself, or was it easy enough for you to actually find that last mile delivery capability already in the market from other players like Sendi, for example?
Kenya has developed a lot in terms of last mile, and this has been driven mostly by the food delivery apps, the Glovo, Jumia Eats and all that. So we did not have to make investment towards that. We simply brought in Sendi, who already had that capability, and off we went. We basically used their infrastructure.
Right. What performance metrics can you share with regards to purchases on your online platforms? You mentioned in some branches it accounts for 50% of the sales that they do make, but what about basket composition? What's the typical basket size looking like, and how's that evolved, at least in the last 4 weeks? It's a small amount of data, or rather small time series, but it would be interesting to hear about that.
Ramah, on average, the usual in-store sales would be having a basket value of about 1,500 shillings to 1,800 shillings. The online is between 5,000 and 7,000 shillings. So it's way higher, first of all. The basket value is way higher online than in the supermarkets. Number two is we've seen a very big shift in categories. Vegetables and fruits is by far the leader in terms of the sales online, and followed by butchery. This is meat, fish, and chicken. And this is very interesting because that is not the same as the usual, physical store. The physical store, usually the dairy products, which is milk products, is a leader, and fruits and vegetables usually are far off in terms of the top categories.
So would it be fair then to argue that in the same way that, saying back in 2007, if you said that people could actually send money through their phones, it seemed like a very alien concept, but within a decade we've seen M-Pesa, mobile money, becoming normalized. Do you think we've essentially crossed that trust barrier now with this crisis, where we've normalized e-commerce and the previous physical shopping experience may not be as important as it used to be?
Yes, Ram, I actually think this is a tipping point, as it were, because once people experience this kind of convenience that is coming with having the order done on your PC or on your mobile phone and delivered to your home, then I do not see people coming back to the stores in the way that they did before, maybe once in a while.
Before I get into the meat and bones of the business, let's talk about the agricultural side of things, because as you mentioned, veggies and fruits are essentially the big volume sellers on the online side. But what about food supply chains? Because we've got this national curfew in place, and the fear has been that essentially will impact, and we're seeing it impacting, a whole range of industries in terms of their ability to actually get to work, to produce, to manage produce from point A to point B. How are you managing that disruption in your supply chain?
We're being allowed to have our trucks, our fleet move around. So what we have done is we have connected with our vegetable and fruit suppliers across the country. And where they cannot move the goods themselves, we are having to deploy our own capability to go and pick these items from the farms. So far, we have not been disrupted. We have not run into shortage. The fear is if it goes for too long, then the farmers themselves who are producing will get out of business, will stop producing, and we may have a problem. But so far, we have not had a challenge with any particular item in the market. We are able to source all the fruit and veg that we require.
And will you still be able to source the inventory you need, at least say for the next 1 month?
Yes, I think we can be able to comfortably survive 1 month. I think beyond 1 month, then we have a problem. If this thing goes beyond May, then we have a problem. But between now and May, I think we've got enough fresh food in the country to be able to supply our customers.
Now then, on to some M&A news. Egypt's Commercial International Bank, or CIB as it's more commonly known, has acquired 51% of Kenya's Mayfair Bank. Kenya Central Bank says this is the latest in a string of deals in the nation's banking sector. Kenya's competition authority said CIB was looking to buy a controlling stake in Mayfair Bank last year. Now, late on Friday, the central bank said that all necessary approvals had now been acquired. Kenya's banking industry has had quite the flurry of deals in the last 3 years after the government capped interest rates, hurting earnings for many banks and then forcing them to look for ways to preserve earnings and survive. The cap on lending rates was removed last November, but lenders are yet to adjust their lending rates higher. Mayfair started operations back in August 2017 as a niche player catering to high net worth individuals and companies. It had a market share of just 0.17%. Speaking of Egypt, authorities over there are easing restrictions over Ramadan. On Thursday, Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli announced changes to curfew and businesses' operating hours. CGTN's Adel El-Marouki has all the details.
While neighboring Muslim countries have increased their curfew hours during the holy month of Ramadan, Egypt is taking an opposite measure. Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli has announced less curfew hours. He's also allowing shops and malls to operate on weekends for the first time since the partial lockdown has been imposed.
It's been 3 months since we first reported COVID-19 cases. So far, our infection rates are acceptable and within expectations. They are very reasonable compared to big countries and relative to our 100 million population. The government has emptied huge space in hospitals by moving cases of mild and no symptoms to alternative quarantine facilities. That has given it confidence to relax its preventive measures.
The government says it's alarmed by the huge influx of citizens in markets and shops due to the limited operating hours. It hopes its measures will decrease crowding. Gradual resumption of public services will resume. After the weekend, notary offices will begin operation and new vehicles registration will be open following a month of suspension.
There is agreement that the virus will last for the foreseeable future and we have to adapt to live with it. Until God wills and we have a vaccine for it, it's why we've been studying how life can resume under this pandemic. We must continue with our personal care and protective measures though, so that we won't have to go back to taking harsher measures.
This relaxation to COVID-19 measures will last until the end of Ramadan. By then, the government will have reviewed its measures and could further ease its pandemic regulations. The government wants to avoid the threats and pain such traffic has on the public, in the streets and in markets. But there are concerns. that pushing the curfew hours to begin at 9 o'clock in the evening could give enough time for many Egyptians to visit family and friends for their daily Ramadan iftar meal. And that poses risks to increased social gatherings and possible COVID-19 infections. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
On to West Africa now. Nigeria's Agriculture Minister, Mohamed Sabon Anono, says that the federal government is taking steps to ensure that farmers, millers and food marketers, generally speaking, can still operate. Among other things, however, a lack of clarity on the restrictions imposed to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic in Nigeria and abroad are stretching fragile food supply chains to breaking point.
Demand for groceries is high across Nigeria, but some vendors are struggling to sell produce that would draw steady demand. Marcy Yelase sits in front of her idle rice mill with mounds of paddy rice going nowhere.
So you can see that the rice, paddy rice I have in large quantity. I cannot mill because the marketers are not coming. They have stopped coming. When they start to come, I can mill everything here and they will buy.
Although food truck drivers are meant to be exempt from lockdown restrictions, many are afraid for their own safety or fear they will be fined or arrested by overzealous police.
There's no clarity around what can move around or what trucks can move around or what assets or what is essential transportation. So you see many of our transporters and truck owners are scared or because they're scared to go out and have their drivers on the road because they are worried that they're going to get held or detained because there's no clarity.
30% of Tracking Logistics firm Kobo 360's fleets across Nigeria, Kenya, Togo, Ghana and Uganda are not operating as a result. This results in huge losses for farmers whose crop rot in the fields or at the depot.
Before, if we carry load,
Before, to deliver goods for someone to this market, we would collect 65,000 naira. And the highest amount of money we will spend on the road as tips is 5,000 naira. But now you can spend almost 35,000 naira. Who wants to come by road? They have blocked everywhere.
Scarcity has driven up prices of the main staple foods beyond the reach of some people since lockdowns were announced in 3 states at the end of March to tame the spread of the virus.
This lockdown has affected food so much. Before, we used to buy gari for 150 naira. Now it costs between 900 and 1,000 naira. A big cup of rice costed 350 naira before, but now it goes for 500 naira. Beans now cost 170 naira from 120 naira. Things are now more expensive.
While domestic crops and capacity go to waste, the imports the region relies on have also dried up as major suppliers including India, Vietnam and Cambodia have reduced or even banned rice exports to make sure their countries have enough food to cope with the pandemic. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
30 minutes into the hour, time for another break. Here's what's coming up. The EU's economic output is forecast to contract by between 5 and 10% this year. And why on earth are Apple and Google teaming up despite being bitter rivals elsewhere? We'll explore why next.
Holding guns. Machine guns from police forces towards the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
business in Africa is at the crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in.
Business in Africa is high risk.
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
Welcome back to the programme. The European Union's economic output will likely shrink by between 5 and 10% in 2020 due to the extraordinary measures that have been taken by governments as they fight the COVID-19 pandemic. That's according to the EU's Industry Commissioner Thierry Breton. Now, he adds that this estimate could be even worse if the EU had to deal with a second round of mass infections. Breton says he's optimistic, nonetheless, about EU leaders eventually working out the details on how to finance and execute the $1.1 trillion emergency fund they agreed to set up this week on Thursday. Many shops around Germany are reopening this week as the country starts to gradually relax restrictions. But the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, is warning the country's citizens not to be complacent. Iris Spitzer filed this report from Berlin.
Like many shops in Germany, this Berlin boutique store has had a tough few weeks.
Walk-in clients, obviously, we had zero, so all that fell away. Luckily enough, we had our online store, which was established beforehand.
But now, their doors are open again. With coronavirus infection rates falling, Germany is gradually reopening for business. But leaders are urging caution.
Wir leben nicht in der Endphase der Pandemie.
We are not living in the final phase of the pandemic, but still at the beginning. We will have to live with the virus for a long time.
Among the public, there are mixed feelings about the return to normalcy.
It's
good for trade and commerce, but you shouldn't open too much. Otherwise, in 3 or 4 weeks, we might be back to where we were 4 weeks ago.
People are going to get sick. It's not okay. They shouldn't open up. They should wait 2 or 3 months until August, and then maybe. Take it slowly.
But Europe's largest economy is hoping to limit the damage. The head of Germany's Council of Economic Experts said this week he expects growth to fall by at least 5.5% this year. Health officials here believe that the virus's reproduction rate, that's the average number of people that a sick person infects, is currently below 1, largely due to public health measures. However, they've warned that if that number goes back above 1, some restrictions could be reimposed. Iris Spitzer, CGTN, Berlin.
Singapore has built a solid reputation as among the most food-secure countries on the planet, while other regional economies do fall much lower on the annual Global Food Security Index. But with COVID-19 decimating incomes, wrecking supply chains right across the world, can Southeast Asian countries ensure their citizens have enough to eat? CGTN's Mary Lou explores that question.
With the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, food security in the ASEAN region could become even more of an issue for the most vulnerable. The tiny island nation of Singapore is almost completely dependent on food imports, producing only 10% of its nutritional needs locally.
There's been a recognition within the government of Singapore's vulnerability to food imported from outside. So there's always been plans, but the most resilience strategy to import 170 countries. That's actually part of a systematic planning exercise to try and ensure that we don't have over-dependence on a small number of countries for a single food product.
Experts say that many governments in Southeast Asia have adopted stronger food security policies after the last global food crisis of 2007-2008, when some countries only had stockpiles of a few weeks and were battling rising commodity prices, including oil.
Countries have become more cognizant of the need to stockpile more than, say, a month or 2 weeks supply. So now a lot of countries have sort of 2 to 4 months of stockpile. Now oil prices also come into play. If the oil prices are high, obviously oil prices are low, they have a bit more buffer to spend on other things, including support and subsidies for the most vulnerable in their populations, and also obviously buying food.
Despite the fact that governments in the region are better prepared this time around, a perfect storm could be forming, with restrictions on the movement of labor and border closures impacting logistics and therefore food supply. This can lead to artificial shortages, even when there is enough food in circulation.
We have a number of policies that limit the movement of people, and by limiting the movement of people, you limit the movement of goods, and you create shortage in urban centers, for instance. We have seen directly policies that restrict the movement of goods and what we call export restriction, like Vietnam has done for rice. And for a country like Philippines, it's a very important challenge because we import a lot of rice, including from Vietnam. If the price of rice go up, because that will be the direct impact of this shortage on the market, you may see food instability.
This year, Vietnam holds the chairmanship of ASEAN, an association with aims to encourage joint endeavors in Southeast Asia. To prevent the region from experiencing another food crisis, experts believe that policymakers should collaboratively manage food supply chain issues during the coronavirus pandemic to avoid panic and protectionism. Mary Lou, CGTN, Singapore.
Unemployment in the United States does continue to surge to levels we've not really seen, to be honest, since the Great Depression, with just over 4 million claims filed in the last week. In the last 1 month, 1 in 6 Americans has lost their jobs due to this pandemic. CGTN's Owen Fairclough has the latest.
Frank Hodges was furloughed from his waiting job in a Washington, D.C. restaurant when the COVID-19 pandemic began to devastate the U.S. economy.
As of right now, I'm working nowhere, so I have no source of income. I'm currently trying to get unemployment. It's been really rough.
He's one of 26.5 million Americans who have registered for unemployment benefits over the past 5 weeks.
Before the pandemic, the US was enjoying what's known as maximum employment, with some sectors struggling to fill job vacancies. But with the unemployment rate among those receiving benefits now at 11%, some economists fear that number will nearly double by the end of April.
The economy cannot reopen fast enough for President Donald Trump as he eyes re-election in November, and people in some states defy stay-at-home orders to protest weeks of lockdown.
It's been encouraging to watch states begin to open up, and it really has been. It's a beautiful thing to see as restrictions are lifted.
Even so, while the overall unemployment number is staggering, the latest unemployment claims marked the 3rd straight weekly decline. And while Frank expects to return to his job, economists now worry about how many millions of US jobs will be lost for good.
Hey, like Martin Luther King Jr. say, we shall overcome.
Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Among the heroes to emerge during this pandemic in Hungary are bicycle couriers. They're helping to deliver masks to housebound citizens and even food to the homeless. As Isabel Owing now reports, some Hungarians who've lost their jobs are now turning to bicycle delivery as a way to put food on their tables.
There's not as much work for bicycle couriers in a country under lockdown. One Budapest company is losing money because its clients don't need as many deliveries. But that hasn't stopped it from helping out amid the public health crisis, including delivering masks to residents for free.
Because of our job, we have to meet people and be out on the streets anyway, so we try to help those who don't have to leave their homes.
The company boss says people in all sorts of careers who have lost work as a result of the pandemic have been in touch asking for a job.
Musicians, actors, a dentist. Lots of people want to join us as careers. In the case of a dentist, the virus outbreak means a full stop to their job. Many want to join, but we can't employ everyone.
A volunteer group that prepares and collects food donations and delivers them by bike has had to cancel some of its charity projects so it doesn't risk spreading the virus, but it's helping out in other ways.
Now 90% of the shelters don't accept any homeless people because of the virus outbreak. Our task is to take care of these people and give them masks and hand sanitizer, for example.
When lockdown rules were introduced a month ago, traffic decreased and bikes ruled the roads. But since then, the government has made all public parking free with the aim of thinning out crowds on public transport. But that's meant more people driving and more cars filling up the central business district.
When they first introduced the restrictions, there were significantly fewer cars on the roads of Budapest. Now there are more cars again. The discipline has apparently loosened up a little. But even now, there are much fewer cars than normal.
The volunteer group has also seen a surge in generosity from the public.
Now we are focusing mainly on delivering the homeless fruit and vitamins to strengthen their immune system. People are much more helpful now. We've received a lot more donations than before.
And as well as doing good for the community, cycling is a way to adhere to social distancing rules while soaking up some much-needed fresh air. Isabel Ewing, CGTN, Budapest.
Now, in the battle against COVID-19, contact tracing, you're going to be hearing that word a lot. That's essentially the process of tracking the infected persons and separating them from those who aren't. Contact tracing is crucial in allowing cities and states to reopen for business. But now that monumental task now has two Silicon Valley titans, or often bitter rivals, working together to develop a solution. CGTN's Ramah Nyang explores this unlikely alliance on What's Hot tonight.
In the battle against COVID-19, an unusual partnership has formed between rivals known for their cutthroat competition, Apple and Google.
The first thought came to my mind is, Marvels and DC, Avengers and Justice League, getting together to fight a common enemy.
The two companies recently announced they'll use Bluetooth signals to track whether a mobile user has come into proximity with someone who's tested positive for the virus.
There's a back-end system that can notify you that you have been within a certain foot range of an individual that's been exposed. This brings it to almost half the planet, because half the planet has a phone that runs either iOS or Android.
But there are still questions about accuracy.
Bluetooth has a range typically of 30 feet, but there's a lot of concern that you could be randomly going by someone, 20, 30 feet away and get that ping signal when in fact you didn't really expose, yourself to that person in terms of the potential for the virus to spread. So there's a lot of concern about false positives, and then what would happen there? Then will people ignore it? Will it be sort of the boy who cries wolf?
The plan for Google and Apple is to, in May, start allowing interoperability between iOS and Android devices and to allow public health authorities to build apps on top of those systems. Then, in later months, the two companies will build broader-based tracing platforms within the operating system, but all those plans depend upon users opting in.
I know that in China, you have a QR, they have to have it green, you have to, every place you go, they check it, they make sure that you're okay. The same thing with Hong Kong, when you have this bracelet, which is, if you leave the house, then they will be alerted for that one. We are not up to this very strict rules. We're trying to convince people, and I'm talking about Google and Apple and the authorities here, they're trying to tell them, listen, this is for the benefits of everybody.
Apple and Google say they'll use software that generates encrypted codes that won't include identifying information or location data.
We just came from 2018 and 2019 with tech companies themselves being actually, at the middle of a big scandals about, selling privacy, selling all the information. Now you are bringing them to the picture saying that those people are going to help you. This is the opportunity to show the users and society that we can help.
But I think there's no question in my mind that after this all starts to play out, other questions will start to be raised about how phones are being used or potentially could be misused in ways that people are not going to care for.
Apple and Google are not the first to use Bluetooth for contact tracing, but no one else has what the two tech giants have already. Billions of existing users. With the right software, they can be traced across city, state, and ultimately international boundaries. Mark New, CGTN, Mountain View, California.
All right, then a quick run through commodities for you. Just about everywhere you look in commodities, not just today, but pretty much for this entire week, month, hell, the entire year, everyone is in the red. Brent and WTI in between 72% and 68% lower so far this year. Brent's June contract just over $21 a barrel. And since Boni Light, that's essentially the premium Nigerian grade, is trading at a discount of about $3 to that, Nigeria has cargo on the market selling in the high teens that no one's really buying right now. That's a fiscal nightmare, whichever way you look at it. Industrial metals also all in the red. Slight recovery, though, in April for the copper forwards in London, 4% higher. But gold, of course, clear winner here. Spot prices nearly 9% higher in the course of the month. Here's what's coming up shortly. We'll look at an online grocer that's coming out a new market for itself amidst the coronavirus pandemic in South Africa.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to the program. On to South Africa now, where an online grocer has carved out a market for its ready-to-cook meals in Gauteng province, which is essentially the epicenter of the country's COVID-19 outbreak. South Africa is nearing 4,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19. Over 1,000 people have recovered, but at least 75 people have also died. Flavour & Co. is one of a few companies that's providing an alternative to home-cooked meals in Gauteng province, as CGTN's Julie Shire reports on Grassroots tonight.
Jeannie Erickson and Dee Gullen started Flavour & Co. 18 months ago, long before the world heard of COVID-19. The idea was to provide South Africans with wholesome meals at the click of a button and take the hard work out of cooking. With restaurants, takeaways and retail delis closed during lockdown, it's now an essential business.
It really does help people. So people don't have to go out and shop. We do the recipe meal kits, which are pre-measured ingredients. You get your recipe, pre-measured ingredients, all the potatoes, the onions, whatever you need to make that recipe. The second thing we do are ready-made frozen meals, which are very diverse. We've got a beautiful plant-based range, as well as things from butter chicken to chili, non-carne to sumac chicken casserole.
Since lockdown began in late March, the e-grocer's seen demand spike mainly from older customers and people who've fallen ill.
We've had quite a few COVID-19 patients, and they are so grateful. They sort of call us their food warriors in a way, because they can't go out and at least we can deliver to them. We've actually created a care package for the elderly, and a lot of people are buying for mothers, fathers, neighbours, people that are really incapacitated.
The utmost care is taken to ensure the food is fresh and prepared safely by this team, and from here it's packed and delivered to customers all over Gauteng.
It's been a bit tough because we've had to do our own deliveries and so on, but we managed. We kind of just doing everything. So between my partner Dee and myself, and our hope is we getting things done. We have a very strict policy that hands get washed every half hour without fail. It's kind of like a built-in thing. We wear masks when we deliver. We very often just drop outside the door, phone them and they'll come and collect.
The COVID-19 lockdown has brought uncertainty for many micro-enterprises in South Africa, but it's been an unexpected boost for Flavour & Co. and other small businesses in its network. Julie Shire, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
One last story for you, this one from Uganda. Millions of citizens over there, pretty much like you and I, are adapting to having to work remotely during this pandemic. They've turned to using a range of platforms as diverse as Zoom, Slack, WebEx, the lot, more for the not for the very first time. CGTN's Hilary Eyesiga now explores how Ugandans are adopting to this new norm and all the challenges that come with it.
Solomon Tumwesige presents his day's work plan. This is not his usual workplace, but at home.
The virtual office is as convenient as it gets under the circumstances that we are in now. We can still meet online, you can share. Typically you would meet your team and show them something practically on the PC.
The Uganda government is encouraging people to stay home during the lockdown. But to keep business going, Solomon and his workmates meet often on this office virtual setup. But it comes at a cost.
Data drops sometimes, the signal goes off sometimes, but we have to work with what we have. So sometimes you have to find yourself working with 2-3 different service providers to maintain a smooth run in the network.
And he's not the only one working from home. Andrew Connor is an architect.
WhatsApp is what I'm using so much because there I can send the proposal, what I call the preliminary proposal. I send it to the client looks at it, and then from there he's able to tell me that, I want this to be like this, I want this to be like that.
All this comes at a time when employers are threatening to lay off workers because of the impact of COVID-19.
People can keep their jobs if only they can be able to adapt some tools. The problem that many people do have is that they resist change even when change is here to stay. So you either adapt to the technology or you die.
Solomon believes that switching to digital platforms could help many businesses keep afloat during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Hilary Eyesiga, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
All right, then let's wrap up the program with a look at the currencies. So for the calendar, essentially for the next couple of weeks, Kenya is going to be holding its next rate-setting meeting next week. And there may be some interesting macro data in there after action statement, especially on the economic damage that's being inflicted by this pandemic so far in the East African economy. We'll keep a very close eye on that for you. The rand is still weakening against the dollar. It's actually down by nearly 8% in the last 4 weeks. There's still a lot of questions on how the country's finance minister will fund that $25 billion stimulus and recovery package announced earlier on in the week. When those details come, they're likely to be in a revised budget to Parliament. That is a data pack that we're all waiting for quite eagerly. So that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here really in the last hour or so. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.